Hi there, my name is Abigail Collinsworth, and today I will be presenting on lab grown meats and the goods, the bads, and everything else you need to know in between. So, to start off with, I want to talk about what people did, how people began eating meats. So, prehistoric people began eating meat about 2.6 million years ago, and it was because the planet was going through a dry spell and a heat wave that killed off a lot of the vegetation. So what they did is they ended up having to scavenge a lot of the things, a lot of the meats from saber-toothed tigers after they would make their kill. So people had to find a way to sustain themselves after their vegetation was completely, mostly killed off. So they ended up not hunting, scavenging for meats, and then eventually, as time went on, they did learn to hunt after watching a saber-toothed tigers. They learned how to hunt small things and work their way up. And then eventually they got around to cooking things, and there's a lot of speculation that that happened accidentally by possibly an animal accidentally catching on fire somehow, and then the people finding the burnt animal and thinking this looks good and then trying it and seeing that it was good. So that's an interesting little tidbit about that. But over time, um, um, sorry, over time, the way people eat meat began to evolve. And in the modern day, Americans eat a lot of meat. The average person will eat about 7,000 animals in their lifetime, which is a lot. And livestock take up 30% of all of the land on Earth. They also create 18% of greenhouse gas emissions, which is not good, and contribute a lot to global warming, which is obviously something we want to handle. Um, Vegetarianism and veganism are on the rise, however, as people are beginning to realize that the earth is starting to kind of shrivel up and die. So people are starting to take responsibility and go vegan or vegetarianism, because they find that it is best for themselves or best for the planet. Consuming all of that meat, though, is bad. Like, it's not doing good. It is only harming ourselves and the planet. And I say ourselves because red meat is really bad. Red meat, when excessively consumed, can cause some cancers, and it's also high in fat and cholesterol. Grain, on the other hand, is something that they use to feed the cows and the chickens, and it could be used instead to feed the hungry of the world. But because the prices are driven so high up to feed the livestock, well, now the hungry can't afford to buy the grain. And all of the water that is being used to water these animals could be used to irrigate crops. All right, so there is an alternative that science has been looking into, and it's lab grown meats. Well, what are lab grown meats? Essentially, it's a meat grown in a lab. Um, it is basically when you take the muscle cell of an animal, place it in a very sterile petri dish, and then give it all of the heat and nutrients and water that it needs to grow and continue growing until it reaches about what you would kind of picture to be a patty, like beef patty sort of deal, so that, yeah. But meat grown in a lab can be expensive. The very first meat grown beef patty was in 2013, and it cost $300,000 to make. So that is a lot. But since then, prices have been dropping, which is good. Um, Another question that is often one of concern is, are they safe? And my answer for that is that they're actually safer than real meat grown from an animal, because they're grown in such a sterile environment that they don't need antibiotics that you would give an animal. They don't use steroids, they just don't need it. And so they're exposed to far less bacteria, far less infection than a regular livestock animal would. Um, And in fact, one tissue sample from a cow can create as many as 80,000 quarter pounders, which is incredible that you can get that many, hamburgers and not even have to kill an animal for it. Like, that's pretty cool. And then they also may be commercially available within the next few years, but there are still some things being worked out by the FDA and USDA. So the good things from lab grown meats are obviously very good for the environment. You know, people have been looking for ways to help the environment and clean up our oceans and clean up waste and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And we could do that significantly if we just ate less meat or used this method of growing meat. If we switched entirely to this, think of all of the greenhouse gases that would be lowered. That would be extremely significant. And because of the grain no longer being used for the cows and chicken, people would have more access to that food. It would be easier access. Prices of grain would drop. So people would be able to afford it, and we could use the water for other things like growing plants. It is extremely sterile. Like I said, it has to be a sterile environment to grow in because the scientists obviously don't want to poison the meat. So they make sure that everything they're using is very sterile and the meat is actually really, really clean. No animals die if you're using lab grown meats because all you need is a little muscle tissue sample. And then from there you can make a ton of meat. And no animals have to die, so it's guilt-free essentially. And with lab grown meats, there's plenty of room for other things to grow in place of the livestock that there once was. But with everything that's good, there are always drawbacks. So some of the bad things that there are with lab grown meats is that it is expensive to make. Like I said, in 2013, the first lab grown burger was $300,000. And though prices have dropped since then, it's still not quite accessible enough for everyone to get their hands on immediately. There still has to be a lot of work done to bring those prices down and make it more affordable and accessible to everyone. Another bad-ish thing about the meat is that it is just muscle, so it is actually very dry and not tender at all, which is not what people usually go for in a meat. And not really what you want to bite into in a steak. You don't want the dry toughness of pure muscle. You want something tender and juicy. So that is something that with time will be improved upon, but for now it's not great. Another thing is that farmers are going to be put at risk for this. So if you think of how much they depend on their livestock to bring home food for their families or just for themselves to support themselves. And then once the rise of lab grown meats starts to go up, they won't be able to keep up with it most likely because it's going to cost the same, but one is guilt free. So the farmers are probably going to be at a very high risk for losing a lot of money and being very economically challenged once this becomes more commercially available. There are also some alternatives that could still be explored so that we don't have to eat meat altogether. And some of the alternatives can be a little weird, but some of them are more normal, like vegetarianism, everyone knows about, and tofu is pretty standard. But there is also a rise in people eating bugs, specifically crickets, to get their proteins. Which can be a little bit deterring for a lot of people. Another not great thing about it is that it uses a lot of energy, and if you are not using a sustainable form of energy to produce these lab-grown meats, well then that's not great for the environment either, and at the end of the day, are you really doing that much good? And then the final not great thing about lab-grown meats is that there are still a lot of hijinks being worked out by the FDA and the USDA. They're still kind of fighting over who's overseeing what, even though the FDA is overseeing production as of right now, and the USDA is overseeing the marketing and sale of it. But there has been some squabbling back and forth between the two of them over who would do what. So, in conclusion, there are a lot of goods and a lot of bads to this, but in my opinion, the good far outweighs the bad because when we look at the grand scheme of things, this is going to greatly impact the environment and the people. And having those lean meats that are high in muscle and lower in fat are going to be healthier for us anyway. Um, and a lot of the problems that we're facing with the lab grown meats will be fixed in a few years. There isn't much to be concerned about. And at the end of the day, the one thing that is important is that change has to happen. We cannot go on living the way we are, and something has to be done about the consumption of meat in the US and all over the world because right now it's not great. But to end on a good note, this is the future. I mean, there's a lot of good happening as well. So I don't think we need to worry too much. I think we're onto something good. And that is my presentation. Thank you for listening and have a good night.